Hey, what is up everybody? Platform Disciple here, and we are continuing our review of the Rebellion set. But real quick, I want to tell everyone, in case they didn't know, that when I was talking about pre-order rewards, including the platinum cards, I believe I mentioned, at least in the comments of my videos, I don't know if I actually said it in the videos themselves, that part of the benefit of pre-ordering is that the platinum cards and platinum foils, particularly the platinum foils, are worth a lot more to people who like collecting the cards. And just to give you some insight, I had a foil Helix worm, and I traded it for a Martyr Golem, 1-for-1. So if you have foil cards that may be competitively viable, then you can trade for very nice cards, is all I'm trying to say. So just throwing it out there, and it does depend on the viability of the foil card. Not just any platinum foil is worth as much as a Martyr Golem, but Helix Worm is an uncommon, so I traded a foil platinum uncommon for one of the most desirable rares in the game, or legends in the game. It's just worth thinking about. But anyways, the more important part of this video is we are reviewing Verore, the Rebellion cards from Verore, and I'm really excited about the Verore cards in particular, so let's get into it. Aliram is a super weird card, and I have been testing it. So outside of the command zone, Aliram is worthless. Let's just say that. There's no reason to use this card if it's outside of the command zone. But in the command zone, at the beginning of the game, you can select a number, and from what I saw, you can go anywhere from 1 to probably 99. Of course, you're probably never going to go higher than a certain number, and you're never going to go lower than a certain number. I'd like to say that, because the odds of you losing before turn 5 are extremely low, like phenomenally low. You'd have to be trying to kill yourself, and even then it would be difficult to lose before turn 5. So turn 5 is generally the lowest you're gonna go, and I think the highest that you can reasonably go is, I don't know, like 15, but that's just such a random number. I would probably, in testing, the highest I've gone was 12, and it did not turn out to be relevant because my opponent, they had lethal, but they didn't push for lethal that particular turn. So anyways, the card gives you a full reset if you correctly determined which turn you're going to lose the game on. And this is also one of the cards that I'm most excited to bring you guys like a deck tech about, because I've already designed a very cool deck around this. So I think the card is playable, and here's why. It's such a cool, unique card. I can't get over it, because it lets the player who has Aliram make a very skill-dependent judgment that can massively impact the game. It also, Aliram uniquely slows down the game, and I mentioned that the game, a lot of these decks push for control very quickly, and that's kind of a problem. But Aliram, you can essentially punish the fastest decks in the game extremely powerfully if you have a good understanding of how fast that deck is. So game knowledge, experience, overall skill. It's a very skill dependent card, and I like that a lot, and I think it's pretty good if you have the correct ability to judge. And one more thing I want to say is that at a bare minimum, even if you're not that good at judging, I think if you choose either turn 5 through turn 7, it gives you a full turn where you can get completely dumpstered. Like you can just like you can bend over and just take it for a full turn without having a board wipe, and that alone is pretty nice. All right. Moving on, Angel's Bane. The effect is super good, and this is one we've already seen. The effect is super good. The stats are super good. The trick is making Verore and Overseers work well together, and we have Regicide as well, which we've already seen. I'll quickly bring that up. It's the same faction combination. So if you can make these factions work together, it's a very powerful card, I think. And I do think that these factions can work together at least a tier 2 level. I don't know if it'll reach tier 1, but it's definitely a playable card. All right, Defiant Brute is another one we've already talked about. I think the effect is very powerful, but as someone astutely pointed out, and I'm not sure who it was, whether it was one of my subscribers in the comments, or you know what, I think it was ES, and I have been told that it's not S, it's ES, said that Verore doesn't need to see the opponent's hand nearly as much as other factions do, because Verore tends to be the one calling the shots with Death Ray and Mass Death. That being said, Verore does have access to a lot of cards that can overcharge things, and it has okay stats for a Verore card. All right, next up. And Disease Brute is one that I need to talk about from two perspectives. I think in Constructed, it's generally just not going to be that great, even though it's a very strong card, because it's very defensive. I just think that Verore has other ways to defend itself that work very well. But that being said, this is a common, and in Rift Run, I've been playing a lot of Verore recently, and every time I see this card, I can't justify not picking it. It's so strong in Rift Run. The stats on this card, as far as Rift Run goes, are insane, and it's good. It's like insanely powerful in the defense zone, and it's not a bad card for the assault zone either. So I think as far as Rift Run goes, this actually takes Verore and pushes it up like a tier in terms of playability, because I think Verore was actually kind of a weaker faction in Rift Run. I mean, not like a bad one, but with the addition of a Disease Brute, completely changes it, because like I said, it's a common, and commons are what really determine the playability in Rift Run, because they make up the large majority of your card pool. All right, Intimidating Brute, another one we've already seen. My opinion of it hasn't changed, and it's also a common. It has no business in Constructed, whereas Disease Brute might have some business in Constructed, and it's not a bad pick in Rift Run, but like compared to Disease Brute, which takes the same cost slot and serves a very similar defensive purpose with like good stats. I mean, this is not really that good, but this is very good. Like, if you manage to get Disease Brutes, like if you manage to get 3 Disease Brutes, there's absolutely no reason to pick Intimidating Brute unless your other picks are horrible. So I don't like the card. Moving on, Malignant. This card, I've tested it. I've seen it played against me. I have used it against other people. I think it's easily a top tier Verore card. It's very easy for Verore to kill multiple characters, and it's got good stats, and it just keeps coming back for free. It's such a good value generator. Admittedly, it's vulnerable to cards that remove it from the graveyard, but it's just really, really, really strong. And I also want to say that you can get even more, you can like squeeze even more power out of the card by putting them in the command zone in addition to the deck. The deck that I'm gonna feature after I reveal the cards is running 1 in the command zone and 3 in the deck. Admittedly, I only have 4, so I can't test any more than that. But the card's good enough that I could even imagine you could go really, really ham and run 3 in the command zone and 3 in the deck. But like I said, that would make you very vulnerable to graveyard hate because you'd put so much of your power in that one card. Super good. Next, Martyr of Death, and this card, my initial reaction, I think when I was like opening the packs, was like, why not just run the Calamity? But now that I've been testing it and I've seen it, we got to talk about it more, because first of all, destroying all characters triggers the morale loss, whereas the Calamity doesn't. And the morale loss when you're playing a control Verore deck is massively important. So that's one thing. In addition, you can use it in the command zone. And if you use it in the command zone, when you play it on turn 10, you can sacrifice it immediately. So you don't have to wait that turn for it to overcome its summoning sickness for you Magic players out there, or for it to unexhaust or become available to use its effect, is what I'm saying. And then one more thing we got to mention is that Dark Wish, and Dark Wish is such a good card, but we've got to quickly stop and talk about Dark Wish. Prior to this set coming out, I always viewed a Dark Wish as like 8 times out of 10 draw 3 cards, and then like the remaining other 2 times out of 10 search your deck for a very specific hate card or card that you need specifically at that moment, or do 10 damage to a character. I would never touch the make a 10/10 demon. I'd never touch raise a character to your support zone. But with the introduction of Martyr of Death, you have a very, very powerful card that you can return to your support zone from the graveyard. And prior to this, there wasn't really any card in Triple Verore that you'd want to have back that would be worth, because it's an opportunity cost when you play Dark Wish. Like, you have to say, would I rather have drawn 3 cards, or would I rather resurrect a character? And most of the times, Verore is going to want to draw 3 cards. But Martyr of Death is definitely worth resurrecting. It's first of all, it can push for damage relatively well, but much more importantly, like I said, is this effect, kills everything, knocks their morale down. It's very powerful. All right, next up, Rancid, and I gotta talk about this in terms of Rift Run as well, although I have not played Rift Run with the final remaining cards. I've only played with the waves 1 through 3. My prediction is, as an uncommon, this could be a very, very powerful tool for Verore and Rift Run. It's just such a huge bomb. But let's talk about it in Constructed as well. This card, to begin, removes all characters from your opponent's graveyard from the game, and that alone is quite powerful, especially against sleepers or other decks that can take advantage of the graveyard. So that effect alone is very, very good. It's not worth 10, but it's definitely worth something. Like, I could imagine a card removing all characters from the graveyard costing 4, and it would be a reasonable sideboard tool. In addition to that, this guy is so big, and it really does a few things. So like, it punishes graveyard-based decks, but one thing in particular, in addition to just absolutely giving the middle finger to sleepers, is that Rita, one of the problematic cards that people complain about that I talked about in one of my previous videos, Rita produces a lot of fodder. And if your opponent has been spamming Rita and is planning on using Death Blast, removing their whole graveyard from the game and getting something that's like quite literally going to be an 80/80 with the amount of crap they've filled their graveyard with is pretty awesome. It's got Unstoppable too, so if they don't have removal for it, it can win the game by itself very easily. That being said, if they do have the removal for it, putting 10 resources into something that has no other effect, really, other than removing their graveyard, which is a big effect, it's not that great, but it has a lot of potential, is what I'm saying, especially in Rift Run, especially as a tool against sleepers, especially as a tool against Rita. But like, if we compare it to other 10 cost cards, like Martyr of Death, for example, or a lot of the new Warpath cards, like Dragon of the Autumn Wind, like a lot of the high cost cards in the game now have an immediate impact on the outcome of the game, in a very, very, very impressive way. Whereas Rancid doesn't immediately change the game in a lot of cases, unless you're playing against sleepers, in which case it might just win the game immediately. All right, next up, Acquire. And I'm really excited about this card as well, because it does a few really interesting things. First of all, paying 4 for 3 cards is pretty damn good. And depending on the matchup, you could be getting cards that are extremely effective. Like, I played a deck recently that was, it was only 1 purity in Verore, but I managed to get my hands on my opponent's Oblivion and cast Oblivion, and it was like completely game changing because my opponent had no idea it was coming. And like, admittedly, that's a very, very rare circumstance that something like that happens, but it can happen is the thing. But the more interesting thing I want to say is that I mentioned in the past that people call the Descendants of the Dragon's Exile Sleeper deck that uses Tibat a mill deck. But that's not really right, because it doesn't force your opponent to draw their deck or burn their cards. Acquire, though, is a actual mill card. And between Recycle and Gather Thoughts, you can play multiple Acquires in the game and use them over and over. So you can force your opponent to draw their whole deck, and then they lose 10 morale per turn, is I believe what happens when they've run out of cards in their deck. So it's a potential win condition that could replace Demoralize, because the decks that use Demoralize essentially try to kill your opponent's characters and lower their morale. And Demoralize is a card that lowers the morale, and then you can recycle it over and over to close out the game. But with Acquire, it costs 1 less. It doesn't immediately lower their morale, but it puts a lifespan on the game. It makes the game guaranteed to last a shorter amount of time. And it also draws you cards, so it's definitely worth considering as an alternate win condition. But I just want to throw it out real quickly, even though we haven't gotten to the neutral cards yet, that if Acquire Mill turns out to be very strong, Time for Fun is a hard counter to Mill. Putting 20 cards in your deck for 1 is gonna completely shut down decks that force you to draw your whole deck. So I don't think that Acquire Mill is ever gonna be unfair. Might be annoying though. All right, Ashes to Ashes, and we have to talk about this in conjunction to Dust to Dust. And I think both of these cards are quite strong, and I think worth noting is that Ashes to Ashes in the control-heavy Verore decks actually can replace or at least be an upgrade to Death Ray, which is a very, very big deal, because it can be cast once as something that is almost always going to be a Death Ray, because if you're playing a control deck, your opponent is not going to be putting their guys in their defense zone. So this card works as a Death Ray, but it also puts Dust to Dust in your hand. And Dust to Dust in a control deck is frequently not going to do anything, but you have access to Word of Command, which, I mean, you can kill one of their guys, but much more importantly, you get another Ashes to Ashes at that point. So Ashes to Ashes and Dust to Dust, particularly Ashes to Ashes, are very good. I expect to see a lot of Ashes to Ashes in people's decks because I think it's an upgrade to Death Ray in a lot of circumstances. I expect to see very few Dust to Dust, except when it comes out of Ashes to Ashes. Okay, Death Blast. We've already seen this one, but we have to talk about it much more again because the card's been changed quite a bit. So first of all, it's no longer a unique ability, so you can run as many of these in your deck as you want without having to worry about it. And it also doesn't remove your entire graveyard of characters from the game. It only removes the top 10, which means you can kind of play multiple Death Blasts, but it also caps out at 10. So the most damage Death Blast can do is 20. I think this is for the better because the card, like, I had games where Death Blast would hit for 50 or more. They were not most games, but when it did happen, it was very clear that there was something problematic about the card, and it also is important that this card is capped out because of Rita producing many characters in your graveyard without really having to put forth that much effort or even run that many characters in your deck. But now I think the comparison between Death Blast and it might be Dark Blast. We're just going to quickly find it. Yeah, Dark Blast. The comparison between Death Blast and Dark Blast is much more important now because Dark Blast and Death Blast now serve the same purpose, which is to just do a lot of direct damage. Whereas before, I think that Death Blast was very clearly a finisher win condition that for aggro decks. Whereas now I think it's pretty much a Dark Blast that is superior in decks that have a lot of characters, whereas Dark Blast is superior in a deck that is more spell heavy. So I think the card's very good still, but I think it's much less likely to be abusable now that it caps at 10. So that's good. All right. We already talked about Dust to Dust, so Regicide. And I've already talked about Regicide a little. The big struggle is making these two factions work together, but I have tested the card, and it's extremely powerful against certain decks and certain command zones. It's not very helpful against others, but at a bare minimum, being able to just expend one resource while playing other characters to pressure the board is very important. Like, let's say I'm against a Flame Dawn deck and they have in the command zone, they have Kali. If they have Kali in the command zone, there's a very real possibility of Kali coming out on turn 3 in the assault zone, and I might play Deathray that turn. If Deathray hits Kali, then I'm in good shape. But if they don't play Kali and Deathray misses, I lose a lot of tempo because I wasted my turn 3 to do nothing. I even lost a card. Whereas with Regicide, I can play a 2-drop in addition to playing Regicide, which means if Regicide doesn't connect, I'm not down in tempo nearly as much. And it's also worth noting that if your opponent has multiple commanders that they could play in a given turn, Regicide will take care of them all. Like if you're against the Tinker deck and they have Aether Acolyte in the command zone, when they have 2 Aether Acolytes in the command zone, which is the way Tinker combo always is going to be, it's very hard to justify playing a card like Deathray when there's really a coin toss of which one they play. There's not really any way to tell which Aether Acolyte is going to be put onto the battlefield. You just know one of them's coming out potentially. But with Regicide, you don't have to know which one's coming out. You just have to know one's coming out. And that's a lot easier judgment to make than knowing which one's coming out. So the point is the card is quite good, I think. And the Praise of Fame, okay, so the effect is good. The cost is a little high. The big upside of this card is that it can hit command zone, which is extremely important. But I would say the drawback of the card is that it's 2 purity, and once you get to 3 purity, it's no longer relevant because you're going to run Annihilate. And Annihilate is better 10 times out of 10. It's always better. It can hit every zone that Price of Fame can hit, and it can hit other things. It can hit non-unique characters. It can hit artifacts. It can hit locations. So the Price of Fame is only ever relevant if you're 2 purity. And at 2 purity, the kind of deck that you might be playing might not really want this effect. It could be a good sideboard card potentially because it does do a very good job of taking care of cards like Rita or Alita, any Alita. And it does a very good job of taking care of Overseers in general. Overseers has a plethora of extremely high threat unique characters. So I see some potential as a sideboard card, but other than that, I think it's weaker than the other options Verore has. And lastly, we have Painstone, which I've been testing, and I don't know how strong it is yet. It's hard to tell. It definitely boosts the power level and viability of some cards like Heatwave. I think Heatwave is generally pretty crappy, but when you have Painstone, Heatwave becomes extremely powerful. So Painstone, at a bare minimum, is increasing the playability of cards that already exist that were not as playable. And I mean, you can have multiple Painstones out, which further increases that power. I just don't know yet whether it's worth putting 4 resources into that. It has a lot of potential. That's what I will say right now. I have tested it. It definitely helps in certain cases, but sometimes I'd rather just have a damage effect instead of Painstone itself. I'd rather have like another piece of removal instead of this card, which essentially boosts my removal. So it's hard to say. And we are done with Verore cards, and next up we will be looking at Flame Dawn.